Hello, my name is Justin Bates, and I'll be writing my dissertation about a group of Latter-day Saint Christians who traveled to California aboard the ship Brooklyn in 1846. As part of my research, I've identified some scholarly works on the America History and Life database that will help to enhance my understanding of the early Californian context into which these saints emigrated and lived. So let's go ahead and take a look at those articles. The first work is a scholarly article called Yerba Buena Biographies, and it goes through several men who were influential in the founding of Yerba Buena, which is the city that would ultimately become San Francisco. The article takes each man one at a time, briefly explaining his origins, accomplishments, usually an anecdote or two, and ultimately explains where and how he died. It's a pretty straightforward series of biographical summaries. The unspecified author uses a variety of sources, including secondary scholarly sources, as well as legal documents and correspondence contemporary to the era, to describe the activities and enterprises of these various men. In terms of methodology, the information is delivered in a largely narrative style without much analysis. The sequence of the men described seems arbitrary, as it is neither chronological nor alphabetical. The authors do not draw specific conclusions in the article so much as use the sources to shed light on these often overlooked historical figures. The value for my research is in learning more about Nathan Spear in particular, whose businesses were a precursor to the agricultural production industry that the Brooklyn Saints would help to develop in San Francisco, and then the other is William A. Richardson, who was arguably the founder of Yerba Buena. Keeping on the subject of William Richardson, my second article is called William A. Richardson, founder and first resident of Yerba Buena. In terms of the sources and methodology, the unspecified author uses an effective blend of primary sources such as letters and memoirs, combined judiciously with secondary historical commentaries to provide a brief, albeit informative, description of this pioneer. He systematically uses these sources to make the case that Richardson was an integral, if often forgotten, contributor to San Francisco's eventual greatness. In the content, the author makes effective use of the aforementioned primary sources, sprinkled with some amusing anecdotes to weave a narrative of Richardson's life, both before arriving in Yerba Buena and afterward. In terms of the conclusions, the author seeks primarily to shed light on what he calls a somewhat shadowy and relatively unknown figure, despite his being a pioneer component of some importance. Given the quality of the research and the analysis, he appears to have proven that thesis, at least in my estimation. This understanding will help me to better appreciate the foundational context of Yerba Buena into which the Brooklyn Saints would shortly find themselves. The last article is by Brian McGinty, called Could One of These Have Been the City? McGinty relies heavily on primary sources to provide an accurate and interesting narrative from the perspective of those who lived through it. For example, he quotes the memoirs of a young William T. Sherman and his recollections of the events in the 1840s. In terms of the content, the author describes several small towns in early California that competed to become the dominant metropolis in early Northern California. He described how a series of events culminating in the Brooklyn Saints paper announcing Yerba Buena's name change helped to put the newly renamed San Francisco on the map, both literally and figuratively. In terms of conclusions, the author makes a compelling case that, contrary to popular belief, San Francisco becoming the dominant metropolis in Northern California was not a foregone conclusion in the late 1840s. This will help to establish the contextual status of the Bay Area shortly after the Saints' arrival and how they participated in making San Francisco a dominant force in the area. Now, how will these contribute to my dissertation? Building on the work that I did for my thesis regarding the Brooklyn Saints' impact on early education, communication, and settlement in the Bay Area, these sources will help me to better understand the early Californian context into which the Saints landed. Both biographical articles about some of Yerba Buena's early pioneers will help me to gauge economic, social, political, and religious baselines at that point, against which I can then measure changes in those areas after the arrival of the Saints. McGinty's analysis of the determinants of San Francisco becoming a dominant metropolis in Northern California and the role that the Brooklyn Saints played in that development will also help inform my thesis regarding their impact. In summary, this dissertation will argue that the 1846 arrival of the Latter-day Saint pioneers from the ship Brooklyn to the Bay Area had a significant impact on the early development and colonization of that area in the mid-1800s. Given these newly discovered sources, I now have a better understanding of the foundational context upon which the Brooklyn Saints would build thereafter. Thank you.